welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on an era that, well, you could argue it's the true origin story for our modern world, and especially for our modern anxieties. It's a time of just staggering technological leaps forward that, at the same time, seems to sink into this abyss of social contradiction. We are, of course, talking about the Victorian period.
Right, roughly those 70 years between 1832 and 1901. And you're so right about the anxiety. If you want to understand that extreme pressure we feel today, that constant, tug of war between our curated public persona and our messy private doubts, you have to look at the Victorians.
They were the first ones to really deal with it.
They were the first generation to truly face the shock of modernity head-on. The era was a crucible, a cauldron of paradox, and our mission today is to act as time travelers. We're going to use the sources, their literature, their sociology, their history, to understand the violent transformation that forged the world we now live in.
And when you say paradox, it's almost unbelievable when you lay it all out. On one hand, you have the sheer speed of progress. The national railways, the telegraph, the Crystal Palace, celebrating this global industrial might, the very foundations of modern science.
And on the other hand, grinding urban poverty, child labor, and a physical filth so pervasive that it literally threatened to halt the British government. It's just, the contrast is staggering.
Then you have the moral paradox on top of that. This ironclad, rigid moral code. This intense obsession with respectability and, absolute sexual propriety.
But it was constantly crashing headlong into rampant transgression. There was this thriving, hidden sexual underground that only fueled this deep sense of public dishonesty.
The sources are so clear on this. The anxieties they were mapping, the speed of change, the crisis of faith, the struggle for an authentic identity under all this new capitalist pressure, these are still very much our anxieties.
It is. It's both fascinating and, frankly, deeply unsettling to realize how little the fundamental challenges of a high-speed industrial society have changed.
So let's unpack this. Where do we even start?
We need to start by understanding the external forces, the things that first cracked open the old world and created this new one.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start with section 1, the Great Acceleration. How did the forces of history completely remake the world in those 70 years?
Right. And I think we have to begin with the political starting line. And it's not actually Queen Victoria's coronation. It's a little earlier. We have to look at the Reform Act of 1832.
Okay, so this is before her reign, but it's the catalyst.
It's the literary and sociological starting gun. It wasn't just about expanding voting rights, that's part of it, but it fundamentally and irreversibly began a massive transfer of power.
And that transfer is the key seismic shift we need to grasp, right? Because before 1832, power was, it was concentrated in the hands of the landed aristocracy.
Exactly. Your standing was determined by your birthright, by the land you inherited. It was an ancient system. The Reform Act and the other acts that came after it signaled the rapid, unstoppable rise of the industrial middle class.
The new money.
The new money. The factory owners, the bankers, the merchants, the urban lawyers, the people who were actually generating the immense wealth in this booming new industrial economy. These men, energized by a doctrine of hard work and self-reliance, effectively took political power from the old guard.
So the world suddenly starts to prioritize capital and merit, or at least the performance of merit, over ancient lineage.
Precisely. And that transition immediately defines the central conflicts in their literature, doesn't it?
It has to.
Absolutely. The tension between the old established families and the new, often morally ambiguous industrialists, this is the raw material for the great social realist novels. They are the heroes and, more often the villains of Dickens and Trollope.
It's that classic old money versus new money conflict we still see today.
It is. The historian Eric Hobsbawm famously called the Victorian era the age of capital, and that new economic reality was the force that just completely rewired society physically and mentally.
And that physical transformation was immediate and jarring. Let's talk about that for a second. The timeline the source material gives us for the industrial and physical remaking of Britain.
It's mind-boggling.
In 1832, almost everything is moved by horse and cart. It's a slow, pastoral world in many ways. By 1901, you have steam engines, massive steamships, the first automobiles.
It's a profound, fast change. The world didn't just get faster, it shrank. It linked the colonies to the motherland with fast shipping and, crucially, telegraph cables. This was literally the age of the Great Acceleration.
But the societal cost was immense.
Yeah.
And it changed the physical landscape forever.
Irrevocably, you see this mass migration from what they imagined as this idyllic pastoral countryside into these hellish, sooty manufacturing towns. Manchester, Birmingham, the rapid, uncontrolled expansion of London.
And the sources are so clear on this. The factories created a completely new social class, a concentrated urban working class.
Which then generated these overwhelming social problems that nobody knew how to deal with. Disease, overcrowding, crime on a scale never seen before. This raw human misery became the central moral dilemma and the necessary subject matter for the era's great social literature.
But I think the ultimate illustration of that tension, that paradox between celebrated progress and profound filth, has to be the story of the Great Stink of 1858. It's just such a powerful, visceral detail.
It is the perfect anecdote because it shows progress literally choking on itself. So think about it. The Victorians had developed indoor toilets and running water. That's progress, right?
A modern convenience.
But the plumbing simply directed all the raw waste straight into the River Thames.
Which was also London's main source of drinking water.
Exactly. For years, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Then, the heat wave of summer 1858 hits, the river level drops, and all that concentrated human and industrial waste just starts baking.
And the smell. I mean, the sources detail that the resulting stench was so overwhelming that it literally forced Parliament to suspend its session.
Can you imagine that? The government of the most powerful empire on earth could not function because the smell of its own sewage was unbearable. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime to try and mask it, but nothing worked.
It's a perfect physical manifestation of their moral hypocrisy, isn't it?
It is. They could build the towering, beautiful Crystal Palace to celebrate technological supremacy at the Great Exhibition of 1851. But the fundamental infrastructure supporting their daily lives was collapsing under the strain of that very progress.
So the Great Stink was the catalyst. It was the immediate, disgusting wake-up call.
It broke the political gridlock. Parliament was finally spurred to approve the massive public works project, the construction of the modern sewer system, designed by the brilliant Joseph Bazalgette.
And that's the legacy, that struggle between the polished, respectable facade and the subterranean rot. It's so central to their art, particularly in a novel like Dickens' Bleak House, where the rot of the legal system and the physical rot of the city are one and the same thing.
Exactly. Now, let's pivot from a physical piece of infrastructure, the sewer, to another one, and its psychological impact. The railway.
Railway. It was so much more than just tracks and a steam engine.
Oh, it was a psychological revolution. It standardized existence in ways that we just completely take for granted today.
How so?
Well, before the railway, time was localized. Every town operated on its own clock, usually determined by the highest point of the sun. But when you have trains running between cities, you absolutely need a coordinated national schedule.
To prevent catastrophic crashes.
To prevent crashes, exactly. So the railway forced the standardization of time, creating what they called railway time. For the very first time, everyone in Britain operated on the same clock.
Which fundamentally changes people's relationship with time, with punctuality, with scheduling.
Everything. And crucially, it also democratized travel. It allowed the middle and even some of the working class people to move around the country in a way that had been unthinkable just a generation before.
And this new mobility, you couple that with new, cheaper printing methods, and it fuels the explosive popularity of serialized fiction. This is where the railway novel is born.
Precisely. The sources really emphasize that Dickens mastered this new medium like no one else. The format, these cheap, portable installments delivered monthly, it was perfectly suited for a train journey. It created a new kind of leisure time and a guaranteed distribution network, the railway lines themselves.
So Dickens was essentially the Steven Spielberg of his day.
That is the perfect analogy. He crafted these powerful, agonizing cliffhangers at the end of every single installment.
So you had to keep buying the next part.
You had to. It turned reading into this dynamic, shared national experience. Everyone, from the factory owner to the clerk, was waiting with bated breath for the next chapter of the Old Curiosity Shop or Pickwick Papers. They'd gather at the docks to get the latest installments off the ships from England.
It's a direct connection to our modern experience of prestige television, isn't it? The complex character arcs, the deliberate withholding of information, the season finales that keep you desperate for the next episode.
That entire structure is a Victorian innovation. It was perfectly adapted to the technological disruption of the railway age.
It just goes to show, as soon as technology creates a new distribution method, narrative forms immediately adapt to exploit it. But, while the railway was standardizing time, science was absolutely detonating certainty.
That's the perfect description because Perhaps the biggest shockwave of the entire era came in 1859, with the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species.
This was a cultural and a spiritual bomb. I mean, for centuries, Western society had been comfortable with the biblical creation story. Humanity was divinely ordained, created in God's image, and placed at the center of a comfortable, ordered universe.
And Darwin replaces that comforting narrative with something terrifyingly vast and impersonal. Suddenly, humanity wasn't the center of creation. We were merely an advanced branch of an impersonal, competitive, natural world governed by natural selection and random variation.
The universe was suddenly indifferent to human suffering and morality.
Totally indifferent. That seismic shift, the replacement of divine certainty with biological chance, sparked what they accurately termed the crisis of faith.
And you see the devastating psychological fallout everywhere in their art. The comfortable ground of spiritual certainty it collapsed.
You think of Thomas Hardy, whose novels like Tess of the D'Urbervilles are just steeped in this profound sense of cosmic irony. His characters are basically playthings of merciless chance and circumstance. The famous line at the end, "The president of the immortals had ended his sport with Tess." It's just brutal.
And Matthew Arnold's famous poem, Dover Beach, captures this loss perfectly. He laments the melancholy, long, withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. It's receding, it's pulling back, and it's leaving them exposed and terrified on this dark, uncertain shore.
So you have this massive external transformation going on. Economic power is shifting, cities are exploding into soot and sewage, technology is accelerating faster than anyone can comprehend, and the very foundation of religious certainty is cracking wide open. The Victorian world was being forced to move too fast.
That sets the stage perfectly for the internal crisis. I mean, how did the Victorian individual even begin to cope with all of that speed and uncertainty?
Well, that's the thing, they tried. And that leads us directly into section 2, where we examine the psychological fallout of this change, the divided self, and how they tried desperately to maintain control through social performance.
Okay, so the Victorian individual. The sources describe them as a walking, talking study in contradiction. They were products of what the sociologist Emile Durkheim would later call anomie.
And this is such a crucial concept for understanding the psychology of the era. Anomie is basically a state of normlessness. It's what happens when rapid social change like industrialization and collapsing religious certainty renders the old moral rules useless.
So people feel morally disoriented.
Disoriented, disconnected, lacking purpose. They no longer knew exactly how to behave because the goalposts just kept moving faster and faster.
And to combat that paralyzing feeling of chaos, they didn't really look inward for answers. They looked outward and created this thing called the cult of respectability.
The cult of respectability was the public self. It was the outward performance of unwavering stability. It was an extremely rigorous, almost theatrical code of conduct.
What did that involve?
It emphasized hard work, strict moral rigor, absolute sexual propriety, and above all, domestic stability. The home was a fortress against the chaos outside. It was a massive societal effort to enforce stability when they felt everything else was spiraling out of control.
So it was pure high-stakes performance. But the sources highlight that this rigid requirement for public virtue, coupled with the immense change outside, led directly to widespread psychological repression.
And what we now call dual identity syndrome.
Right, and this is why the work of Sigmund Freud, who was born in 1856, is so steeped in this Victorian psychological landscape.
Absolutely. He argued that this relentless societal pressure to deny the darker sexual or aggressive parts of the self didn't make those parts disappear. Of course not. It just forced them down into the subconscious, creating neuroses and critically double lives.
The public self was the iron mask of respectability.
And the private self was tormented by doubt and forbidden desires.
And for this reason, there is no better, more terrifying allegory for the repressed Victorian psyche than Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which came out in 1886.
It's the perfect novel of the age because it externalizes that psychological split. Dr. Jekyll is the paragon of the Victorian gentleman. Wealthy, educated, socially compliant, utterly respectable.
Mr. Hyde.
Mr. Hyde is the physical embodiment of the unconstrained id. He is the monstrous, the animalistic, the violent part of the self that Victorian society insisted must be denied and repressed entirely.
And Stevenson's setting is so crucial. It embodies that urban Gothic aesthetic. London, with its rapid growth, became this dense, crowded, labyrinthine space, and it was often shrouded in that famous London fog.
And the fog is not just bad weather, it's pollution, both literal from the coal smoke and metaphorical. It symbolizes the moral confusion, the toxic fallout of industrialization. The dense, anonymous city became the ideal environment for the repressed self to act out.
This is where the first modern serial killers, like Jack the Ripper, emerge.
Precisely, because urban anonymity gave license to the hide inside respectable men. In the crowds, you could commit unspeakable acts and then just vanish back into the world of respectability by simply adjusting your coat and hat. The police, who were a new force themselves, just couldn't cope with this new scale of urban anonymity.
Speaking of anonymity and repression, we have to address the most common myth, the universally prudish Victorian. We picture them as completely sexless and buttoned up.
Right, covering piano legs because they were too suggestive.
Exactly. But the sources paint a far more complex and volatile reality.
It's absolutely a half-truth, and we have to debunk it. Yes, public discourse was aggressively censored. You couldn't speak of sexuality in polite society. The ideal of the angel in the house was promoted everywhere. But beneath that veneer, this was a society obsessed with and struggling to contain its own sexuality.
And the evidence for that it's staggering. The sources confirm an explosion in the production and consumption of pornography, especially as photography became more widespread late in the century.
And then there's prostitution. Tragically known at the time as the great social evil, it was rampant. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of women were working as prostitutes in London alone.
So their prudery wasn't an absence of desire at all.
No, it was a frantic, desperate public performance designed to contain the powerful desires that a wealthy, industrialized, and increasingly anonymous society had unleashed. They couldn't suppress sex, they could only hide it, which led directly to the systemic hypocrisy that defines the era.
So the question then becomes, how did they maintain this massive, thriving underground world while simultaneously upholding this ironclad public morality? It seems impossible.
Well, that's the core tension. The maintenance of that double consciousness required a strict separation of spheres, the domestic versus the public, the wealthy West End versus the impoverished East End. And it required a collective denial.
With sort of gentleman's agreement not to talk about it.
Exactly. Everyone knew the brothels existed, everyone knew respectable men visited them, but the moment that reality crossed the boundary into the respectable parlor, it was instantly denied and erased.
And this is where the insights from thinkers like Michel Foucault and Stephen Marcus become so vital to understanding this control mechanism.
Foucault, when he looked at the history of sexuality, argued that the Victorians weren't repressive in the sense of just silencing sex. They were obsessed with controlling and cataloging it.
What does that mean exactly?
The power resided in the act of definition. By creating new medical and legal categories, the homosexual, the hysterical woman, the degenerate, they created new mechanisms of social control. They created types of people, and then they policed those types. It was a way of managing desire by putting it into boxes.
And Stephen Marcus, in his landmark work, The Other Victorians, confirmed this by diving into the archives.
Right. He looked at the medical texts, the anonymous erotica, and he showed that the supposed silence was actually filled with obsessive, clinical, or exploitative descriptions of sexual life. The hypocrisy wasn't incidental to the system, it was the mechanism of the system.
And nowhere was this hypocrisy and this double standard more brutally enforced than in the discussion of gender roles, which led to the explosive woman question.
Oh, absolutely. The ideal woman was, of course, the angel in the house. Pious, submissive, confined purely to the domestic sphere.
And the sources give us this terrifying physical reality of that ideal. Kite lacing was common, leading to women fainting in their corsets as a daily occurrence, just due to physical confinement and restricted breathing.
And this physical collapse was often romanticized as feminine delicacy, not seen as a sign of, systemic oppression.
But this rigid ideal is what fueled the century's most profound social movements.
It did. It led directly to the fight for women's education, the passing of the Married Women's Property Acts, which finally allowed married women to own and manage property separately from their husbands, ending their legal status as chattel, and eventually the fight for suffrage.
But crucially, the sexual double standard ensured this oppression was maintained, all under the guise of protection.
Male transgression, adultery, visiting brothels, maintaining mistresses was ignored, maybe sighed over, but ultimately considered an unfortunate necessity of male nature. But a woman's fall, a single sexual misstep, even if she was coerced,
meant total social ruin.
Total. She lost her standing, her financial security, her moral purity. It often resulted in complete destitution.
And that's why the fallen woman is such a tragic, recurring figure in Victorian fiction. In Elizabeth Gaskell's Ruth, or Thomas Hardy's devastating test of the D'Urbervilles, these characters are held up to the light.
To expose the brutal, unforgiving nature of the very morality the Victorians claimed to cherish, their morality was ultimately based on controlling women, not on any genuine sense of charity or justice.
So we've tracked the external progress, forcing this internal repression, creating this highly pressurized, dualistic individual. The next logical step, then, is to see how the Victorians channeled all of this profound social pressure, this chaos and hypocrisy, into their literature.
Exactly. Which brings us to Section 3, literature as the nation's conscience and panic button.
The novel really solidifies its place during this era as the dominant literary form, doesn't it? Largely because it becomes the primary tool for social inquiry.
It does. The Victorians developed a sophisticated sociological imagination, that ability to connect personal troubles to broader public issues.
And this imagination was often channeled through the figure of the flaneur. Now, the flaneur is more than just a casual stroller. This is a crucial component of Victorian sociology.
Absolutely. The flaneur is the anonymous, detached observer of city life. And crucially, he is financially privileged enough to just wander the crowded streets without having to work. He has the analytical distance to observe the stark inequalities without being personally touched by them.
This privileged observation is what fueled the great social novels. It allowed writers to document the misery that the middle class was actively trying to ignore.
And the undisputed master of this was, of course, Charles Dickens. He effectively acted as an investigative journalist. His novels had immediate, real-life political consequences, forcing the comfortable middle and upper classes to confront the moral cost of their industrial progress.
Let's dive into the specifics of that. The reform impact of Oliver Twist, which was serialized from 1837 to 1839. It was a direct expose of the horrific realities of the new poor law of 1834.
Right, and to understand the novel's impact, you have to understand the law it was fighting. The 1834 law was based on something called the principle of less eligibility.
Which meant what?
It meant that the conditions inside the state-run workhouses had to be worse than the life of the poorest independent laborer outside.
So it was specifically designed to discourage people from seeking aid.
Deliberately. It was designed to be harsh. It separated families, subjected residents to virtual starvation and pointless hard labor. It was a punitive system.
And Dickens' depiction of the deliberate cruelty, the semi-starvation, the callousness of the parish officials, it exposed this punitive doctrine to a mass readership.
And that infamous scene, Oliver holding out his bowl and saying, "Please, sir, I want some more," it was an immediate cultural explosion. It became the shorthand for the cruelty of the entire system.
And it really did galvanize public opinion.
It did. It fueled movements that led to gradual but definite reforms in child labor laws, in sanitation, and in the general administration of charity. Dickens showed that the novel wasn't just entertainment, it was a powerful political weapon for creating empathy.
But as the century went on, the focus began to shift, didn't it? From these external, systemic social conditions to more internal states.
Exactly, ushering in what we call psychological realism, epitomized by writers like George Eliot and the Brontës.
This was a profound and necessary departure. Instead of focusing on the structures of the workhouse or the chancery court, these writers plunged deep into the inner lives of their characters.
They explored that core conflict between individual aspiration and rigid social duty.
George Eliot, who was, of course, Mary Ann Evans, used her novels like Middlemarch to explore the moral compromises and frustrations of intelligent, striving individuals, particularly women, who were trapped by the limitations of their provincial environments.
She showed the damage that's done when great potential is forced into a small domestic box.
And the Brontë sisters, Charlotte, Emily, Anne, their very act of writing speaks volumes about the constraints of the era.
Oh, completely. The fact that they had to use male pseudonyms, Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, because society simply wasn't ready to accept the intensity, the passion, the raw intellectual depth of female genius.
Jane Eyre, in particular, is cited in the sources as a thunderous declaration.
It is. It's a woman's demand for independence, for spiritual equality, for the right to be a thinking, feeling individual, not just an appendage to a man or a trapped angel in the house. Their novels revealed the acute psychological isolation and the powerful romantic rebellion that was simmering just beneath the surface of the age.
Okay, so if Dickens was the nation's conscience, The sensation novel of the 1860s was the nation's panic button.
That's the perfect way to put it. This genre was the era's true crime podcast mixed with a scandalous, high-octane soap opera.
And it hit the middle class with this visceral force. Wilkie Collins, The Woman in White, and The Moonstone are the perfect examples.
They just crammed in every melodramatic trope you can think of. Amnesia, forged identities, secret marriages, blackmail, illegal confinement in asylums, and characters driven by pure, naked manipulation and greed.
So why did these novels matter so profoundly? Why were they so popular?
Because they didn't safely set the horror in the slums, which the middle class felt comfortably separated from. They placed the terrifying realities, the legal powerlessness of women, institutional corruption, hidden vice-right in the drawing rooms of respectable country houses.
The horror was domestic. It was right next door.
Exactly. The sensation novel directly challenged the fundamental Victorian belief that propriety equaled safety. It showed that the man who looked the most respectable, the lawyer, the doctor, the seemingly kind husband, might be the one holding the secret that destroys the entire family. It was immensely unsettling and sold in astonishing numbers because it affirmed that repressed suspicion that the public facade was all a lie.
And finally, we have to acknowledge the pervasive shadow hanging over all of this literature. The shadow of the empire.
The empire was at its zenith. It was a source of national pride and immense wealth, but it also brought deep moral anxiety and, inevitably, systemic racism and exploitation.
So while you have figures like Rudyard Kipling celebrating the white man's burden and the moral necessity of this civilizing mission,
you have other writers, like Joseph Conrad in Heart of Darkness slightly later, who are beginning to trace the moral corrosion that flows back to Europe from the brutal operations of imperialism.
This connects us directly to Edward Said's foundational theory of Orientalism. This is such a powerful idea that we should take a moment to really unpack it.
Absolutely. Said argued that the West didn't just conquer the East physically, it conquered it imaginatively. Western literature and art created this fantasy of the Orient as being exotic, irrational, sensual, backward, and feminine.
So this construction of the East as the inferior other
Conveniently justified imperial domination and exploitation. If the Orient is inherently chaotic and childlike, then it requires the stern, rational, masculine hand of Britain to civilize it.
And we can apply this post-colonial critique to even the most canonical texts. Let's reread Jane Eyre through this lens. What about Bertha Mason, the Creole heiress from the West Indies, the terrifying, violent, mad woman in the attic?
She's often interpreted now as being far more than just a symbol of the author's repressed rage or a Gothic trope.
She is the living embodiment of the colonial other.
She is the uncontrollable, non-British, non-white world that the empire feared and tried so desperately to contain and repress. Rochester tried to lock away his colonial history and his savage wife in the attic of his respectable English home, but her chaos eventually burns the whole house down.
So her presence signifies the moral contamination that the wealth of the empire brought home to England.
Exactly. The literature was wrestling with the ethical cost of global domination, often without even fully realizing it.
So we've covered the chaos, the repression, and the literary response. And now we jump back to today because the most fascinating realization is that we are not done with the Victorian era. At all. We are still living and operating entirely on the blueprint they left for us.
Their problems are quite literally our problems, just dressed up in digital rather than steam-powered technologies.
That brings us to section 4. The Victorian blueprint. Why on earth are we still living in their world?
The sources call our modern dilemma the Victorian Experience 2.0, and it starts with the cost of progress and technological ethics. The Victorians debated, often acrimoniously, the moral and social implications of the telegraph, which sped up communication to what they felt was an unnatural degree.
And the railway and industrial machinery.
They grappled with the genuine fear that technology might fundamentally dehumanize society by making man a mere cog in a colossal industrial machine.
And what does this all mean for us today? We are having the exact same conversations.
The exact same ones. We are debating the ethical fallout of AI, of genetic engineering, of the ubiquitous nature of social media. We face the same mix of profound awe at the potential of the technology and deep, deep trepidation about the ethical cost.
They asked, will technology accelerate society faster than our moral capacity can keep up?
And we are asking the identical question about AI's impact on labor and truth. We are repeating their fundamental conversation about balancing material efficiency against human values.
Now let's look at their institutional legacy, the material infrastructure they left. For all their hypocrisy and flaws, the Victorians possessed this unparalleled drive for order, standardization, and public utility.
They really created the foundation of modern civil society. We owe them the creation of modern professional police forces, the bobbies, massive public schooling systems, public museums, free public libraries, extensive public parks.
The parks as an antidote to urban density, the lungs of the city.
Right. And of course, large-scale sanitation systems like Bazalgette's sewer network. These institutions, the very bones of modern civil society, were designed to manage the chaos they themselves had unleashed.
And then there's the pervasive ideological legacy they left us with, the self-made myth.
This is a profoundly Victorian concept. It was largely inspired by the hugely popular works of a writer named Samuel Smiles, who wrote a book called Self-Help.
And the ideal was simple.
Deceptively simple. Meritocracy replaces aristocracy. Success is purely the result of individual hard work, thrift, and moral rectitude, pulling oneself up by the bootstraps.
And this ideal remains an incredibly powerful, often unquestioned force in modern American and global political rhetoric.
It does, but it's problematic because it places all the responsibility for success and failure purely on the individual's moral character. It ignores the systemic injustices of class, of inherited wealth, of the systemic poverty that Dickens worked so hard to expose.
So the self-made myth provides a convenient way for those who benefit from the system to blame the poor for their own lack of thrift or industry.
Exactly. That dichotomy, systemic problem versus individual failing, is a direct Victorian inheritance.
Let's move to culture and media, where the echoes are just. They're everywhere. We already talked about serialization, which is the direct ancestor of our modern binge culture.
But also look at genre invention. They invented or codified the genres that still dominate our media landscape today. The detective novel, for one. The roots of science fiction, think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is slightly earlier, but it defines that anxiety over science without limits.
And modern horror. The Gothic tradition peaks with Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde.
And Sherlock Holmes, created by Arthur Conan Doyle in the late Victorian period, remains the USA's most adapted fictional character. Their fascination with using extreme rationality Holmes's logic to navigate the irrational darkness of the anonymous city is still our modern fascination.
But the most powerful connection, the one that really defines the experience of a 21st century person, is the psychological link between their cult of respectability and our experience of identity and social media.
This is where we see the Victorian struggle perfectly translated into the digital age. It's almost a one-to-one comparison.
How so?
Well, the Victorian requirement was to present an immaculate, moral, respectable public self, even if it required agonizing repression of your true feelings. So what is Instagram or LinkedIn or the perfectly curated Facebook profile but the digital corset?
It's the constant performance of professional achievement, perfect parenting, spiritual wellness.
Right, and the anxiety of the 21st century is the same as the Victorian anxiety. The fear that the repressed, messy, anxious, private self, the Mr. Hyde, will be exposed online, ruining the carefully constructed digital facade of respectability.
We're constantly grappling with authenticity and mental health precisely because we inherited their blueprint for the divided self.
We are still trapped between the overwhelming pressure to perform perfection and the messy reality of being human in a high-speed, anonymous, industrial, or post-industrial society.
So let's wrap up by looking at the critical legacy in total, the strengths and the weaknesses of the blueprint they left us.
The immense strength is, without a doubt, the creation of the social novel as a powerful tool for empathy and reform. They solidified the novel as the dominant form of mass communication and cultural critique, and they instilled a deep, almost religious value on literacy, pushing successfully for compulsory public schooling.
But the weakness and the danger, they can't be ignored. The literature often suffered from didacticism.
Yes, that insistence on teaching a moral lesson or forcing a tidy, sentimental ending, which often undercut the raw power of the social critique. And for all their radical exposure of poverty, much of the literature ultimately sought to reaffirm the existing social order.
The solution offered was usually individual charity.
Exactly. A respectable, wealthy person helping a single poor person, rather than advocating for the radical systemic political change that was necessary to dismantle the structures that created the poverty in the first place. This preference for charity over radical justice is a weakness we absolutely still struggle with.
And of course, the dark side, the unquestioning ideologies of empire and the inherent racism that justified global exploitation. Their unshakable belief in material and technological progress often blinded them to the immense human and environmental cost of that industrialization.
So we circle back to the central synthesis. The Victorian period is our origin story, not just historically, but psychologically. They were the first generation to face the world that we now fully inhabit. Global capitalism, dizzying technological disruption, collapsing certainties, and information overload.
They truly mapped the cognitive dissonance and the hypocrisy required to run a modern industrial state that's obsessed with both profit and piety. Their great achievement was articulating these profound struggles through their literature, leaving us a map of the landscape of modernity.
They asked the big, enduring questions. What is the true cost of progress, and who pays it? How do we live an authentic life in a society built on performance? And what are the ethical limits of human dominion, both over nature and over other people?
And that leaves us with the final provocative thought their legacy offers. As we stand at the brink of another great acceleration, one powered by AI, quantum computing, and biotechnology, will we simply repeat the Victorian era? Will we allow efficiency and material gain to constantly eclipse ethics, empathy, and the necessity of systemic social justice?
Or, having observed the flaws of our previous acceleration, have we finally learned to navigate that chasm between technological progress and fundamental humanity with a bit more wisdom? The answer is still being written, and the best way to prepare for it is to understand the history of our last great leap forward.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the paradoxical soul of the Victorian era.